A lot of people want to hear about the biblical sites we visited, and since there's a lot of explanation to go with each one, I didn't think I could just do a photo dump. So I figured I'd create a video and explain each of them along the way. It's probably going to be a pretty long video. So we started out in Egypt, and we didn't necessarily go to any biblical sites here on purpose. However, obviously the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt for 400 years, and Moses was placed on the Nile River here, and we did visit the Nile. And it's also the place where Mary and Joseph and Jesus fled to when he was 2 years old to escape King Herod when he was killing the babies. There's a church dedicated to that, but we really just hung out around the Nile River and saw the other sites here. So from Egypt, we went on a flight to Jordan. We didn't go to the Sinai Peninsula because we were told it wasn't safe, but we did fly over it, and we were able to see Mount Sinai from the airplane. Once in Jordan, where we saw the Red Sea. This is not the portion of the Red Sea that the Israelites crossed over. They were on another fork of it, but the same sea here. And we also went to a Bedouin camp, which is in the desert. This would be the same area of the desert that the Jews spent a portion of their time with. While in the Bedouin camp, we also stayed in tents, like the Israelites would have. Our tents had air conditioning, though. I don't believe theirs did. Interesting thing is the Bedouins are known for being traders of frankincense and myrrh. So when the wise men came to visit Jesus, likely from Babylon, they would have passed through here, and it would seem that they picked up gifts along the way to go visit him. We also went up to Mount Nebo while we were in Jordan. This is the mountain that Moses went up to before the Israelites entered the Promised Land. They went up here to basically spy on Jericho, which you can clearly see from there. The video doesn't show it real well, but you can see Jericho from here and the Jordan River and the Dead Sea. And he went up to the mountain, and he also died up here, so there's a memorial to him up here. There's also a stone that covered I think it was a first century church that was built up here on top of the mountain, and I guess the stones were just the standard way of securing doors back then, so it gives you a good idea of what these look like. It'd be very hard to move, I think. Next, we went down to the Jordan River. As you can see here, there's not really much of the Jordan River left anymore. They use it, both Israel and Jordan use it for irrigation now, and there's very little flowing into the Dead Sea now. So much so that the Dead Sea drops by 3 feet of depth every single year. So it is drying up very, very quickly here. They had a photo of what it looked like 100 years ago. They said it was about 100 feet wide and about 10 feet deep. So when the Israelites crossed, it was actually at flood stage. I don't know exactly how wide it was, but even beyond that. And where we're at is the spot where the Israelites are believed to have crossed over. And it's also the spot where John the Baptist chose to baptize people, which kind of makes sense. The phrase crossing Jordan comes from the Israelites crossing right here. And it's a metaphor for death and rebirth, in which baptism is also a symbol of that. So he chose to baptize people right here, including Jesus. So they have the baptism spot of Jesus right here. Since the water has receded, it's no longer in the water. It's about 100 yards away from the water. And obviously these steps and all that were not here at the time. That's been built since then. It's probably a good time to talk about, like, how do we know these are the spots where these things happened? With a lot of them, it's like a mountain or a river or a city. You know, the city's still there, the remnants of it, and the mountain and the river are still there. So those are easy to locate. Other ones where they pinpoint it beyond that, they use, the mountains and cities and all that for general reference to get them within 2 or 3 miles. But how do they know it's that exact spot? And the answer is more or less most of them. Constantine's mother, Helena, came here in the year 320-something after Constantine converted to Christianity, and went to seek out these spots on purpose and built churches on them. And we still have the remnants of the churches from those times. So at least for the 1700 years, we know the spot has not changed. But what about those first 300 years? How do we know that that was the spot? And the answer is Christianity exploded pretty quickly. After the day of Pentecost, there were 3,000 Christians at least at that point. And by the year 300, it had grown up to over 6 million Christians while it was still legal in the Roman Empire. So in the early days, those 3,000 that were there, they know the spot where John the Baptist baptized at. A lot of them were alive at the same time. And even the ones who were not able to go to those sites, the apostles were still alive and Mary was still alive. So it was able to be communicated to a pretty large number of people very early on. And since that time, they worshiped there, and they had smaller churches where they met in secret in those locations. So when Helena came to visit, it was well known already by the locals where that spot was, because it had been passed down from that time. But this is the spot where Jesus was baptized. And if you come down a little ways down the river, you can see the spot where the river still flows that is closest to that location. So people still come here to this spot to be baptized today because it's as close as you can get. And they get baptized on both sides of the river. There's Jordan here on this close side, and just across the river there, I don't know, 20 feet or whatever that is, that's Israel, and people are baptized on the Israel side as well. We know that this was the location of the baptism from John 1:28, which says, this encounter took place at Bethany, an area east of the Jordan River where John was baptizing. So this is in Bethany. It's on the east side of the river, not in Israel, but in Jordan. From here, we had planned originally to go into Jericho. There's a bridge 5 miles to the north, and we was going to cross that and go straight into Jericho. But apparently the information on the website was inaccurate. It said it was open on the Sabbath until 3 p.m. Apparently it's not open on the Sabbath at all. So we had to drive 100 miles to the north, cross a different border, come back down 100 miles to the south, and that ate up the time we was going to go to Jericho. So we were only able to see Jericho from a distance, not go into it. The next day we went to Bethany. There were 2 sites to see here. One was the shepherd's field, where the angel appeared to the shepherds and announced the birth of Jesus. It's really hard to picture now. This is one of the things I hate about visiting a lot of the sites. They built churches over top of all the locations, so it's no longer a field. It's now, a built-up area with a church on it. So it's very hard to picture what it used to look like. But there are plenty of other fields nearby, so you can just look at one of those and more or less the same, I'm sure. The Shepherd's Field is also the field that Boaz owned from the story of Ruth. So there's everywhere you look, there's a lot of history. Two or three things have happened at most locations. So it's very densely packed with something everywhere. Not too far away from that, of course, is the birthplace of Jesus, which is marked by the Church and the Nativity. We all think of, a stable made of wood and all that, but that's not how they built things back then. It was all stones and caves. So the birthplace of Jesus is actually in a cave that you go down into. The church is built over the entire cave, so it's kind of again, hard to picture a little bit, but you go in here. It was very crowded when we visited. You wait in a long line, which gets narrower and narrower till you go down to the cave, which marks the place where they believe he was born and where the manger sat, are the 2 different locations marked here. Whether it was this exact spot or, half a mile down the road, I don't think it really matters too much. Then, of course, we visited the old city of Jerusalem. We started with the Mount of Olives here, and you'll notice it's completely covered with graves in this valley from the Mount of Olives into Jerusalem. So much so that this valley is known as the Valley of Death. It's also the Kidron Valley. They're one and the same. It's a very, very old cemetery. It dates back thousands of years to the Old Testament prophets. Some of them are buried here in this cemetery. And then more recently, prime ministers and anyone who's able to wants to be buried here, because the Jews believe that when the Messiah comes, he will come from the Mount of Olives and enter this gate here. And they want to be among the first to be resurrected whenever that happens. And of course, whenever Jesus came, that's the very route he took on Palm Sunday. He came from the Mount of Olives and entered this gate right here. Once you go in the gate, or actually before that, there is the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus was arrested. So there's a pretty small garden, but a pretty one that's still maintained. And of course, there's a church right next to it. And, when he was arrested here, he had to walk here through the Valley of Death into the city in order to be crucified. Once you go in the city, one of the first things is the western wall of the temple, of the Temple Mount, I should say. So this is the holiest site for Jews. The reason being that this is as close as they're able to get to the Temple Mound. The Temple Mound is controlled by Muslims at this point, and they do not allow Jews to enter it. Since we are Americans, we are able to enter it during very specific hours. So I was able to go up there and look around a bit. It's mostly an empty courtyard where the temple used to sit. And the reason the Muslims control it, it's so special to them, it's the location of the Dome of the Rock, which that rock was the foundation stone of the temple where the Ark of the Covenant sat. And it's also the same place where Abraham brought Isaac, where he was to sacrifice him before God intervened. So it's a pretty significant spot to all the major religions here. But the Jews are not able to come up here. Starting more or less at the western wall here is the Via Dolorosa. We did not tour the entire thing. We saw, I believe, 3 of the stations where Jesus stumbled, and I believe it was Simon had to carry the cross for him. And then also inside the Church of the Nativity, which is where Via Dolorosa ends. I'm sorry, I should have explained that. This is the path that Jesus took the day he was crucified. And there are 14 different stations here where different events happen along the way, like he was beaten or crucified or buried. All those stations are here along this path. So it ends at the Church of the Nativity, which covers, I think, the last 4 stations of the cross. And inside of here is Golgotha, where Jesus was crucified. And then it says he was buried in a tomb nearby. So they have the tomb where they believe he was buried also marked. Again, it may not be the exact location. They believe it is because, again, people were worshiping there from very early on. So they're pretty confident it is, but even if it was a tomb a little ways farther away, it's still this general area where all this happened. We weren't able to go to the tomb where they believe he is buried because it's under renovation. However, there's a nearby tomb also here that we were able to visit that's very representative. Probably more so because I imagine the real one's probably decorated up to where you can no longer see what it used to look like. The next day we went to a tour to the Sea of Galilee with quite a few stops on the way. The first one was Nazareth. This is where Mary and Joseph lived whenever she became pregnant, prior to having to go to Bethlehem for the census. I was just struck by how far away this is from Bethlehem. It would have been a very, very long walk to take. It was a pretty long bus ride to take. So here we was able to see the Church of the Annunciation. This is where they believe Mary and Joseph's house was. There's a church built on top of it, but they did a pretty good job of keeping the cave intact of how it was. So you can see the cave where it's believed that they lived at and also returned to after Egypt. Along the road, we was able to see many sites along the way. So this is also the road to Damascus, the old road. It's a highway now, but it's the same road that Paul took whenever he was encountered by Christ. And along the way, we was able to see Megiddo, which is Armageddon from Revelation. This is Tel Megiddo, where the battle's supposed to happen. And then we went to the site of the multiplication. And this is one of my more favorite sites to visit, just because they really haven't built up on it at all. And it gives you a good idea. Like, I always wondered, like, how do you talk to 5,000 people without a PA system of some type? And it kind of answered that question pretty well. So Jesus was stood down here at the bottom of this by the road, and along the edges there's hills all around that make a really nice bowl amphitheater. So the people would have gathered on the hill, and it helps carry the voice just like a theater would with good acoustics. So that was a pretty neat sight to see, I thought. Driving along the road, we was able to see Mount Tabor. This is the mountain of the Transfiguration, where, let me think here, I think it was Peter and John, I hope, went up with Jesus and saw Moses and Elijah, and Jesus transformed and heard the voice from heaven. And from there, we didn't actually go up to the mountain, we just saw it from a distance. But from there, we went to the Sea of Galilee. So this is the site of most of Jesus' ministry, a couple of miracles. So when Jesus walked on water, it was right here on the sea. And also the separate currents whenever they were on the boat with the storms and Jesus was asleep in lower deck and he spoke to calm the storms. That also happened here on the sea, as well as most of the preaching at the time was in this area, more or less, along the sea. One of the towns here is the town of Capernaum. This was considered to be Jesus' hometown, more or less, during his ministry. It was the house of Peter. He lived here. They believe they have located it. They found a first century church here. They built a church on top of it, but they have it hovering over, so underneath it is the first century church. and they believe this was the house of Peter that was converted into a church later on. This would be the oldest church, I believe, still in existence in some form. Capernaum, he also, there's a synagogue there where Jesus preached. They built a 4th century synagogue on top of it, which is the nicer one, the white one here with the ruins. But underneath that, the black stones are the ruins of the original synagogue that Jesus would have actually preached in. And from the Sea of Galilee, we went down to the Jordan River. This is not the part of the Jordan River where Jesus was baptized. That was further down by Jericho. But since that's all dried up and pretty dirty, this is the more popular site for people to be baptized now because the water's clean out of the Sea of Galilee, and there's actually some water here. So lots of people getting baptized there, and I was able to actually baptize a lady from our trip. Her name was Rashika, and she was kind of asking around if I was getting baptized, and asked her if she was. She said she wanted to, but didn't really have anyone to baptize her, but I offered, and she accepted. So that was a very, very nice moment we was able to share down there on the Jordan River. I was very thankful for that. Later on, we went to Jaffa. This is a very ancient port city, I think about 3,000 years old. It's right next to Tel Aviv. And this is the port that Jonah set sail from whenever he was told to go to Nineveh, which is in Iraq. He decided not to. He wanted to flee to Tarshish, which is, I think, Spain. So he left from this port and headed out and was swallowed by the big fish, and you know the rest. It's also where Peter stayed with Simon the Tanner whenever he had the vision from God about there no longer being clean and unclean food, or people for that matter. He was on the roof of the house of Simon the Tanner, which is right here, still marked. So he's up there in a vision, waiting to eat pretty much, and had the vision right here on this rooftop. We took another bus ride down to Masada and passed a number of sites along the way. So we passed Jericho again. It's also, we passed a place where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, and in this area in general is where Sodom and Gomorrah was believed to be. But Masada is a fortress built by Herod the Great, and it was a pretty opulent place at the time. But it's more famous whenever the Jews were fighting the Romans. So this is about the year 70 AD. The Pharisees were always concerned there'd be a riot and the Romans would put it down. And that's exactly what happened in the year 70 AD. And this was the last stand of the Jews here. About 3,000 of them, I believe, were up here when the Romans invaded. It's quite a mountain fortress, or a plateau, I guess, fortress up here. It would be very, very hard to get to. And they had stockpiled tons of grain and water and everything else up here to survive a long standout. But the Romans just kind of brute forced and built this massive ramp to siege the place. And I believe it was about 3,000 Jews here decided to basically commit suicide rather than become slaves of the Romans. It's the kind of where Israel ended, basically, in the year 70 AD. And one of the things I find incredible about all this is I don't know if there's any other country in history that has ever existed, ceased to exist, and then returned again. And this happened twice for the Jews. They conquered, taken to Babylon, and returned again after that. And then, in 70 AD, they were pretty much put down by the Romans, and didn't exist again for, 1,900 years until, 1940 something, basically. And here it is again. And I think that's just a awesome story of resurrection. It's very symbolic here. So that was our trip, the shortened version of it, at least.